Hello, this is Matthew Thrift again with the Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Seed and Joiner Realtors, the broker for Simpsonville and also the Greer office. Today, we are going to be going over South Carolina Form 504 and 505. Now, if those don't sound very familiar to you, it's because a lot of times they're not even used. However, when a buyer has to sell or wants to sell a property, or needs to sell a property in order to get a loan to buy another property, this is where these forms are used. Now, I will say this. I've had a lot of conversation with a lot of agents that, for whatever reason, get confused upon these particular documents. And after looking them over multiple times, I can see that there is some confusion on there, so I wanted to try to hopefully get some confusion completely gone out of the way. I did write the legal hotline for the South Carolina Association of Realtors and discussed this with their attorneys down there and got some insight on these particular forms that I'm going to be referring to in this particular video to help you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Again, we're on South Carolina Form 504. And that is entitled the Buyer's Sale Contingency Addendum Amendment to South Carolina Form 310 or 300, or it says Other on the top. So the very first box is number 1 for buyer's property, that you put their current property address that they are either going to sell or currently have listed for sale. You put that information in the description in there. And then there's a whole bunch of check boxes there. Most of the time we see the primary residence checked off, or you see it for sale by owner, and we see whether it's under contract or it's not under contract. And then you obviously have another box with a line that says listed by. So those are pretty self-explanatory, not a whole lot to discuss there. Where it gets a little bit confusing is number 2 on the sale contingency. Now, let me just state this, that South Carolina Contract 310 does not have a specific section in the contract for sale contingencies, which is the reason why Form 504 was created. If you look in the middle portion of South Carolina 310, just under the sales price, there is a line there, it's on the screen, that shows you the contract is either contingent or is not contingent upon the buyer selling their property, and that 504 is or is not attached. Well, I as a broker, if there's a sale contingency, I want to see Form 504 attached to the contract just because it has words and verbalizations in it that kind of make sure everybody's on the same playing field and that everybody understands exactly what's going to happen if another contract comes in while you're under contract with a buyer that has a buyer sale contingency. So let's look at number 2, the sale contingency. And we'll read it. This contract is contingent upon the marketing and closing of the sale of the buyer's property no later than blank calendar days prior to the closing date, and that's the closing date of the current contract that you're working, of the offer that's being made, or on the closing date of, again, the contract that you're currently working. So the buyer is asking for either the time frame for their property to sell so many days prior to closing on the property that they want to buy. We don't normally see this, but every now and then we will see that a buyer will close prior to closing on the property that they're wanting to buy. Most of the time, we see a back-to-back closing. They're difficult, they're not impossible. But again, we very rarely see people closing several days before a property that they want to buy. Typically, we see it closing on the closing date. So that's the buyer sale deadline in the contract contingency for the sale contingency. Okay, so that adds it to Form 310 once we establish the time frame. Let's say a seller only wants to give, if the property is not under contract, it may not be listed. Let's say it just got listed. Maybe a seller only wants to give a buyer 45 days to get their house under contract and sold. You can actually set that time frame. The seller can actually set that time frame if they want to negotiate with the buyer to say, okay, we're only going to give you a certain amount of time to get this done. Otherwise, this thing is completely off. This form actually does that and allows you to do that. It goes on to say, should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the buyer's sale deadline, which is above, the buyer may terminate this contract by notice to the seller, which is a notice of termination, delivered no later than blank business days after the buyer's sale deadline. Now, most of the time people ask me, well, how many days do I put there? Well, as a broker, I want to see things handled and taken care of. I don't particularly think that we need to have any more than 1 or 2 business days for a termination if the buyer's sale deadline is up. If they did not meet their time frame to sell prior to the closing date, or they obviously did not meet it to sell their property by the closing date of the contract that they've written, they need to have a contract to terminate this particular buyer sale contingency completely, so the seller can move on and sell their property to somebody else. Let's go on. It says, should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the buyer's sale deadline, seller may terminate this contract by notice to the buyer, delivered no later than blank business days after the buyer's sale deadline, unless parties agreed on any of these. And then there's 2 boxes that says cash buyer verifies possesses purchase price in USD or US dollars, or buyer's financing is not contingent upon selling buyer's property. Now this is where it gets a little confusing. And even I had to contact the South Carolina Association of Realtors, speak with their legal hotline. And this is basically, well, this is not basically, this is what I received back. And I'll read it. It says, because the SCR forms have to work in a variety of deals, the forms have built-in flexibility. This is one of those areas that's built-in flexibility. SCR504 can operate as you desire. Don't check either box, and seller can terminate under South Carolina 504 as they desire. However, there are certain circumstances where realtors don't want the seller to be able to terminate under South Carolina 504. The examples are what we were just talking about. The cash buyer. The buyer has enough cash in the bank to buy the house, but would prefer not to get a loan to keep their money handy. Okay, so the buyer purchasing the seller's property agrees with the seller, and they say, okay, I'm a cash buyer. I have enough money to purchase this house, but I don't want to spend my cash. I want to try to sell my house first. The buyer and seller can agree on that. So they've already verified the buyer has enough cash to buy the house, but both buyer and seller agree that they want to be able to sell the property first, not have to worry about taking out all their cash. Okay? Or it says the buyer has enough mortgage credit to be able to afford 2 houses at once, but would prefer to sell the old one. So basically, the buyer and seller can agree the buyer's financing is not contingent upon the selling of the buyer's property. So they can accept the buyer sale contingency to sell the property first, knowing that the buyer does not have to sell the property first, and they can agree on that as well, again, to make it flexible in all sort of circumstances. Okay, so South Carolina 504 handles, a multitude of things, however buyer and seller want to handle it. So again, should the sale of the buyer's property not close by the buyer's sale deadline, the seller may terminate this contract by notice to the buyer delivered no later than blank business days after the buyer's sale deadline, unless the parties agree that the cash buyer has enough funds to purchase the property without selling the home first, or the buyer has enough financing credit to be able to purchase the property without having to sell the property first. They can agree on that. Okay? So it goes on to say, South Carolina 504 handles the desired transaction with no check boxes as well. No check boxes in 1 or 2. The buyer or seller can terminate after the buyer's sale deadline. Okay, so it's as simple as that. A lot of the times we don't see these boxes checked. We just see them left open, and they go on with what we continue on as what we used to be known as the 48-hour first right of refusal, or the 72-hour first right of refusal, which basically gives a deadline if the seller receives another contract or offer during the time it's under contract that the buyer is trying to get their property sold. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So let's go on right underneath that paragraph, all in capital letters. If no party terminates via the sale contingency, parties follow the contract without the sale contingency. So we're going to follow it, and here's what we're going to do. Okay, we're going to go to number 3, the buyer's property duties. So between this contract's effective date and the buyer's sell deadline, talking about the contract on the new property, and the buyer's sell deadline for the buyer to sell their old property, okay, the buyer shall, A, make only good faith efforts and actions to sell their buyer's property. Well, that's pretty well a given. I mean, most of the time when a buyer puts their property on the market, they list it with another agent, more than likely they're going to be putting their good faith efforts to sell that property and to get it done, to get it to closing. That's pretty well a given, but it's in black and white. B, timely inform the seller and brokers of pertinent information regarding the sale of the buyer's property. So if anything comes up, God forbid there's a delay or anything, that is the buyer's responsibility to inform the brokers, the sellers, of everything going on with the sale of that property. C, timely direct brokers or law firms to disclose pertinent information regarding the sale of the buyer's property. So basically it allows the agent for the buyer selling that property to inform the other broker and the sellers of what's going on, and to allow that broker to be able to say what's going on. And it also allows the law firm to disclose what's going on. Maybe there's a title problem. Maybe there's a financing problem. Well, this document says that the buyer discloses and allows the law firm or their agent to disclose what's going on with the property as well. D, within blank business days of contract, deliver to seller and brokers copy of each contract for the sale of the buyer's property. So property gets under contract, or if it's already under contract when the offer is written, that realistically with D, it's talking about if it's not under contract, the offer is written, and then it gets under contract within 1 or 2 business days. I prefer 1. I think that's appropriate, but sometimes we see 2, that the buyer would then get that contract over to the seller, so the seller knows, okay, the property is now under contract for the sale of the buyer's property. E, within blank business days of closing, deliver to seller and brokers notice that the buyer's property has closed. So going back up more toward the top of the contract, if the property closes before the other property, the new property is going to close. If it's not contingent on the closing date, if it's closing before that, that E says that the buyer is going to get the closing information and let the seller know and the seller's agent know property is closed, we're good to go, we're continuing on with the sale. Okay? Then it goes on in all capital and bold letters, if buyer defaults or breaches these duties, the seller may seek remedies, for example, terminate and litigate. We all know that these are binding and legal contracts. Number 4, marketing and subsequent offers. This is where we get into what is known, commonly referred to as the right of first refusal, or the 48-hour right of first refusal, or 72 hours, 2 days, or 3 business days, or whatever the case may be. Okay, this one simply says this: sellers may continue to market the property and may accept any offer as a backup contract by using SCR Form 391, which is known as the clauses for addendum form, SCR Form 391, and on the very first page of that, at the bottom, it has backup section. Okay, it says, note, MLS rules may require categorization of seller's listing as other than active. Okay, so seller's going to be going as contingent. Okay, so our MLS in Greenville is going to say contingent upon and it's contingent upon the sale of a buyer's property. Okay, so it's going to show that in the MLS. Upon seller delivering notice to buyer of a subsequent offer from a cash buyer or subsequent offer that does not contain a SCR Form 504, which is what we're discussing, or buyer-sell contingency, the buyer shall, within blank business days, choose and comply with A or B. It's one or the other, okay? The buyer's property is in the process of being listed. It's being marketed. And then all of a sudden, we're under contract, and all of a sudden, the seller gets another offer on their property, okay? So it is the seller's responsibility to notify the buyer, and that's on Form 505, which we'll discuss here in just a second, to notify the buyer that they have another offer that they're considering as a backup offer. And at that point, the buyer now has to take some sort of action within so many business days. Typically, we see 2 or 3 business days on there. Again, that's why we call it, or have called it, the 48-hour or 72-hour first right of refusal. Okay, so if the seller gets another offer, the buyer has to choose one of these 2 things. A, deliver documentation to the seller that buyer's property is under contract of sale scheduled to close by the buyer's sale deadline with no contingencies other than financing and repairs. Okay, that's it. So if the property is not under contract and the seller gets another offer, seller notifies the buyer within so many business days, 2 or 3 or whatever you guys decide. The buyer then has to deliver back to the seller that their property is under contract with no contingencies in it. For example, no Form 504, no sale of another buyer's real property, no contingencies other than financing and repairs. Or they have to choose B, remove the sale contingency only if closing of the buyer's property is not required for buyer to obtain purchase money. So basically, if the buyer that's buying the new house does not have to sell the property, they can get financing without selling the property, they need to go ahead and remove this contingency and go ahead and go on with the purchase. So therefore, that other offer that comes in stays in a backup offer position. The first buyer that's under contract stays in the position, removing this sale contingency, and goes to closing without any contingency whatsoever. So there's only 2 ways that a buyer can go on with this contract if the seller obtains another offer on the property and wants to keep it as a backup. They need to deliver notice that the property is under contract with no contingencies other than financing or repairs, or completely remove the sale contingency if the buyer can purchase the property without having to sell their property first. Underneath that, bold letters, if buyer does timely properly comply with A or B, then buyer remains in the primary first contract position ahead of the subsequent potential buyers that are in the backup position. And seller may only accept the subsequent offer as a backup contract using Form 391 or the clauses for addendum form. But if the buyer does not timely properly comply within the time frame listed right underneath Section 4 with A or B, then either party may terminate this contract by notice and or the notice of termination. Then it says, in witness whereof this contract has been duly executed by the parties, both buyers, both sellers, or seller and buyer both sign the contract, and it goes along with Form 310 and gets under contract. Let's say that the seller gets another offer on their property while they're under contract with buyer A in first position, okay? The seller then has to notify the buyer through their buyer's agent with Form 505, which is currently on the screen. It says buyer sale contingency notice and release addendum/amendment to agreement to buy and sell real estate residential, and then has a blank line. First paragraph, buyer sale contingency. Basically the same wording as the other one. This contract is contingent upon the marketing and closing of the sale of buyer's property. See previously accepted Form 504 in the contract. In accordance with 504, the following notice is delivered to buyer and brokers, and this notice delivery creates a time frame deadline for buyer options and selections below. Basically, the buyer options and selections are the same ones that we were just referring to in 504. They're just spelled out now in writing. The buyer needs to make a choice. Right underneath that, bold capital letters, underline, it says this SCR505 is seller notice to buyer that an acceptable subsequent offer has been received by the seller. The seller notice options, seller select appropriate choice. So basically, the seller is going to provide this to the buyer's agent once another offer is received. The seller is going to check one of these boxes. The first box says the subsequent offer does not contain a buyer's sale contingency or buyer's Form 504, and seller is considering accepting this offer. Even though you're in a contract, the seller is considering accepting. Therefore, buyer is obligated to select from the following choices and deliver notice to seller of selection within SCR 504 timeframe deadline or see the warning. So that 48-hour, 2 business days, or 3 business days, 72-hour, whatever the case may be, it's business days, 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever you guys have decided on, that's the timeline that they're referring to on Form 504. Subsequent offer is or is not attached to this 505 notice delivery to buyer. My personal preference is if you get an offer, redact some of the information being names, sales price, things like that, but submit the document along with this Form 505 to the buyer of the new property that's currently under contract. That way everybody knows this is not a lie, nobody's pulling wool underneath over somebody's eyes or whatever the case may be. It's a legal document, legal offer that the sellers want to consider along with this Form 505. Or the seller is going to let the buyer know the subsequent offer was accepted as a backup contract and your contract remains as primary contract. So basically, seller has a backup, they're not doing anything, they're not pushing the buyer, maybe it contains something else, whatever the case may be, they just accepted it as a backup offer in case the current offer does not go through. They're just giving you notice we have a backup offer on the property. Buyer notice options. The buyer choose one and deliver notice of choice to seller and brokers within the SCR 504 agreed upon time frame. Again, the 48-hour, the 2 business days, 3 business days time frame deadline. If buyer does not deliver, see the warning. Okay? So then we got a whole bunch of boxes underneath this. The very first one is attached is written satisfactory evidence, example the contract, delivered to seller and brokers that buyer's property is under a contract of sale set to close within the buyer's sale deadline with no contingencies other than financing and repairs. So basically it's that buyer delivering to the seller in what is known as Section A of Form 504, where it says deliver the documentation that the buyer's property is under contract. So the buyer is turning this sheet back. They're saying, hey, we've got it under contract. There's no contingencies other than financing repairs. So we're good to go. We're going to continue on with this particular contract. So even though you want to accept this offer, our property is under contract. We're good to go. We've met our contingency at this point, and we're going to go to closing. Or, and this is where the cash buyer comes into play, that the cash buyer has enough property to purchase the property, but does not want to give up all that money. They just want to try to sell their property. Or you have a buyer that has enough credit where they don't have to have they don't have to sell their property before closing. These next 2 boxes, that's basically what they refer to. So it says buyer can close on the property without buyer closing their SCR Form 504 property. So example, cash buyer or buyer can afford a new loan. So the first box, buyer removes buyer-sale contingency from contract and attaches verification of pre-final loan approval for closing, or buyer removes buyer-sale contingency from the contract and attaches verification of cash available for closing. So again, that's if your buyer and seller agreed upon cash buyer being able to purchase without having to sell their property, or they have enough credit to not have to worry about selling the property. They could just have 2 mortgages and be done. So that's more options. Again, these are flexible forms. Below that, buyer options if buyer does not want to remain primary contract. Buyer select and deliver. It says the buyer agrees to become a backup contract to subsequent offer, and subsequent offer becomes the newly primary contract without a buyer sales contingency. Okay? Or the buyer terminates the contract. So basically what would happen here is that buyer did not get their property under contract. Therefore, they want to make sure that they're compliant to still stay as part of a backup. So they're letting, hey, we agree to become a backup on the property. Just keep us as a backup and we'll continue to try to sell our property in case something happens. Or buyer says, I'm sorry, things didn't work out. We're going to go ahead and terminate completely. We didn't get it under contract. We can't buy the property with cash. We don't have enough financing credit to be able to have both mortgages. We got to completely terminate. And no harm, no foul. We're just going to go ahead and do that. And here's your form back. So, but let's look at the warning. If buyer makes no choice and no delivery by the SCR Form 504 time frame delivery deadline, either party may terminate by delivering notice. That's again in 504, and now they're stating it here in 505. Then it says number 2, marketing. The seller may continue to market the property and accept backup contracts. We already know that. That's what Form 504 says. This is just another verification of it. And once this form is delivered by the seller, buyer states what they're going to do. This form gets signed by the buyer. It gets sent back to the seller. And whether it gets terminated, whether their contract becomes backup, whatever the case may be, starts to happen basically all through Form 505. Everybody signs, everybody gets notice and delivery, and we go on from there. So that is a lot. That's a lot to understand. You may need to go back in certain sections of this particular contract, of this particular addendum to kind of understand what's going on here. But for the most part, I think I've given you a very valid explanation of these forms, even though, again, we don't use these forms a whole lot. But in times where there's a low inventory, we definitely see these forms being used. And they don't have to be confusing, as long as you understand the basic premise of they're being used for multiple different things, flexibility for buyer and seller. Hope this has really helped. Again, if I'm not your broker, please, this is my disclaimer on all of my videos. Please talk with your broker. Get their understanding, get exactly what they want you to do with these particular forms. Don't just take my word for it. Make sure you go by your broker's word. And if you still don't understand something, contact the South Carolina Association of Realtors legal hotline. They will be more than happy to explain this as well. It's never my intention to explain something wrong. It's always my intention to explain everything correctly. But if I've made any fault in this particular explanation or video, please, it's not my intent. It's my intent to understand the contract the way I understand it, but I can interpret it differently than what other people do. So please always go by what your broker says. Contact the South Carolina Association of Realtors legal hotline and get their understanding and your understanding as well, if you don't have an understanding, before you use these documents with a buyer and or seller. Please just understand what they're signing so that you can try to explain it to the very best of your ability as well. Have a great day. And thanks again for taking the time to look over and understand Forms 504 and Form 505 through the South Carolina Association of Realtors. Have a great day. Take care.